Okay, so I wanted to talk to you guys about a possible diplomatic alliance united over the Black Sea between Kiev and Ankara, between the Turks and the Ukrainians. So, since the start of this war, the Turks have been supportive of the Ukrainian defense of their territory. And while a lot of this has been through, the same verbal stuff you get from anybody else, this has also been through certain weapon sales. The Bayraktar Turkish drones were very famous and very publicized early on as doing immense damage to Russian columns that were marching on Kiev. But I would say that also helped the Turkish defense companies quite a lot, who were trying to expand their production and very much wanted some ads, and that was an ad. You haven't seen much of those drones performing since the start of the invasion, just a few instances though, but that was an instance that the Turks got a lot of attention for. And the Turks also were helpful when it came to negotiating the grain corridor. Sadly, the grain corridor ended up collapsing as the Russians wanted to initiate a grain blockade on the Ukrainians to economically strangle the country, but that blockade was broken by Ukrainian sea baby drones, which exploded the Russian Black Sea Fleet along with missiles and other weapons, which eventually forced them to pull back far enough that they could transport the grain anyway. But in every one of these instances, Turkey has, generally speaking, been in Ukraine's corner. Now, this could be for a few reasons. One big reason is that, Ukraine is a NATO-aligned power, and Turkey is in NATO. And, the vast majority of consumer power is within Europe, is within the United States, and they want to keep a good relationship with these nations that are extremely sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause and have security interests that are directly tied to it. And so the Turks, wanting to be in good relationship with their NATO allies, I have a direct interest in supporting the Ukrainians. There's also certain norms and standards internationally and in the region that I think they would probably want to be upheld, even though sometimes they break other versions, different norms and standards. But a big thing, at least in my mind, we're going to get to in the later, and this is the biggest thing, because on the and I want to hold that off for a second. We're going to put a pin in it, and we're going to get to it after we go through a few of these articles, because I just want to first get over to the Russians, because Turkey has a cooperative relationship with the Russians. The Turks very famously bought the Russian S-400 air defense systems, which led to a lot of conflict with the United States. The Turks have had cordial diplomacy engaged with the Russians based off of pragmatic grounds. And while the Turks and the Russians have often clashed in some ways, for example, by supporting rival sides in the Syrian civil war, they have, generally speaking, due to the fact that they exist in the same area, have done some amount of strategic hedging to have enough of a beneficial relationship with each other for trade and other purposes. But, when Zelensky met Ukraine, when Zelensky met Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, during all of this hubbub about Ukraine giving up territory and this concession and that concession, the takeaway that Erdogan gave at the meeting was Ukraine's territorial integrity is non-negotiable for Turkey, according to Erdogan. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Tuesday that Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty are non-negotiable for Turkey, as Ankara positions itself as a potential host for talks between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. Turkey's state-run news agency reported. Speaking at a joint press conference with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Ankara, Erdogan said Turkey is ready to support negotiations aimed at achieving lasting peace. The war, which has caused many innocent deaths and widespread destruction, must end now, Erdogan said, adding that the peace has no losers and the world is still waiting for an end to this conflict. His remark came as Russian and U.S. delegations met in Riyadh for the first high-level talks since the war began in 2022. The two sides agreed to continue discussions on ending the war and improving bilateral relations. Now, Erdogan going out of his way to say the territorial integrity is non-negotiable. For him to focus on this here, it makes sense that he'd want to support Ukraine enough to be allied with NATO. It makes sense that, you know, there'd be some amount of like norms in Europe or in this region you want to uphold, but non-negotiable for Turkey when so much stuff has been negotiable with the Russians when it comes to the pragmatic relationship. Why? Why this public positioning, even if a lot of it's for show? Well, I believe that it has to do with the Black Sea. And let me bring you a Ukrainian map up here to give you guys an idea. If you look here, right here, you see all this area here that's occupied by the Russians. This was all controlled by Ukraine up until 3 years ago when the Russians invaded and occupied much of this. And Crimea back in 2014. Now, the Russians in the Black Sea, up until these illegal invasions, had a border with it that went from Sochi all the way up generally to Ras-Van-Don area, in that area. But since the invasions in the last decade, that border area with the Black Sea has expanded from Ras-Van-Don to Mariupol, now down to Berdyansk, down all the way to Sevastopol, along the coastline of Kherson. I mean, that's a big expansion. In fact, Russia has occupied 80% of Ukraine's coastal territory. Now, if you want the Black Sea to be largely dominated by you, Turkey, or you want it to at least be so you are strong enough to deter and to be able to continue to say, hey, I do have rights of passage here in the strait, over here or outside of Istanbul. I do have the right to say military ships can and cannot pass here. You're not powerful enough here to force me to do otherwise. You're not powerful enough here to force terms across my gigantic coastline. Basically, I think the big issue with territory, outside of norms, outside of principled credibility around NATO membership and Turkey standing by its word, I think a lot of this is calculated. I think it's calculated under the idea that they don't want the Russians to control the Ukrainian coastline. They don't want the Russians to control the Black Sea. And if they control the Ukrainian coastline, they're going to control like half of the coastline in the Black Sea and be able to challenge the Turks more directly. And mind you, it's not just in Ukraine where the Russians are like invading areas and taking over coastlines. In Georgia, they took over an area that had coastline. And there's been talk about possible interventions in the future, which would then further expand their hold over the Black Sea. And I don't want to get into any talk about them moving into the former Soviet Union states, because if Romania and Bulgaria, well, then you're getting back to Cold War times where the Turks had to stand up to the entire Soviet Union in the Black Sea, which is not something that they want to return to. So I think that their insistence on the upholding of Ukrainian territorial sovereignty is to be a check on Russian expansionist power in the Black Sea area, which is not like just a little bit of a strategic priority or interest of the Turks. It is their backyard. It is the lake right behind them. And so they do not want to allow that to be dominated by the Russians, who they have had conflicts with in Syria and elsewhere. And they're part of an alliance, Turkey, that is also primarily designed in order to conflict with Russian expansionism and with a possible war with the Russians. So I think it's primarily on the idea of challenging the Russian control of the Black Sea Fleet. And I think that's why Zelensky, knowing this interest that Erdogan has, excited about the idea of Turkey being at the table in the talks. Not just Europe should be at the table. We agree here that Europe should be at the table. It's their backyard. It makes sense. Ukraine should be at the table. They're not at the table yet. Obviously, it's their table. It's their country. They should be at the table. But Turkey, the Black Sea is right in their backyard. Ukraine's right there. They have a border with Russia too. A lot of this naval conflict that is going on in the Black Sea Fleet. A lot of the sea mines that are being dropped in this area can flow down to Turkish coastlines. There could be a strong assertive argument as to why the Turks want to be involved in some manner. And it could be beneficial due to the strength that they have. And then not just hypothetical strength, real military strength. Turkey is one of the most powerful military states in the world. And if they were to really lean in a certain direction, that's real leverage. And it's not just Zelensky that wants this. It's Erdogan as well. And he doesn't want to just be involved. He wants to be the main attraction. Turkey, ideal host for peace talks on Russia-Ukraine war, Erdogan says. Turkish President Recep Erdogan said on February 18th that Turkey is an ideal host for potential peace talks on the Russia war against Ukraine, offering Ankara as a venue for future negotiations. And I quote, "Our country is an ideal host for the negotiations that are likely to begin between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States," he said during a press conference with Zelensky. He highlighted Turkey's previous mediation efforts, including the Black Sea grain deal, which did fall apart, which enabled Ukrainian agricultural exports until Russia withdrew a year into it. He reaffirmed that during his talks with Zelensky, Turkey expressed its support for Ukraine's complete territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. At the same time, I emphasized that we should provide any support to complete the negotiations and establish sustainable peace. This war must end. Zelensky, who postponed the visit, etc., etc. Yeah. Okay. We know that soon, because Donald Trump said so, very soon, in fact, that Donald Trump is going to be having a meeting with Vladimir Putin. That's going to be happening very soon. And Europe needs to assert itself when those negotiations come around. They need to be willing to say, look, we're willing to put force on the ground. We're willing to contribute more defense spending. We're willing to contribute more aid in order to force ourselves to have to be included in the conversation, because once the Americans walk away, we're going to be dominant powers here, and we will make ourselves included. And if the Turks do the same thing with this interest in mind, it can give Ukraine significant leverage. And so just like the Europeans should assert themselves, and the Ukrainians need to assert themselves, maybe for once, and I don't say this often on the channel, maybe the Turks should assert themselves slightly too. Rare Microsoft browser victory. Actually.